Uh, Thanks again for having me today, everyone. What I'd really like to talk to you about is the role of culture in responsible tech. So we know we want to create sustainable products and services underpinned by integrity, trust, and value. And my hypothesis is that culture plays a huge role in making that happen. So when I say culture, what do I mean? Culture refers to the norms of behaviour and shared values among a group of people. So norms of behaviour, the way that groups act together, the behaviours that they teach folks who join their group, the way they recognise who fits and who doesn't. Shared values, important concerns or goals shared by a group that persist over time, even when the group membership changes. So why do I say culture is important for responsible tech? There is a couple of papers by Ron Westrum, and he looks at the typology of organisational cultures, and his studies are based on looking at how culture impacts safety, particularly in the realm of medical or aviation and complex environments. So he says that culture shapes an organisation's response to problems. Probably the most helpful insight is to see culture as a set of processes that shapes an organisation's response to the challenges that organisations face. And I see part of responsible tech as how an organisation responds to challenges. So Ron identified three typologies of organisational culture. He's a socialist, a social researcher, looks at the impacts of culture on safety, and he identifies that the way information flows within an organisation reflects its culture. And based on typical patterns of information flow, he identified three types of cultures: pathological, bureaucratic, and generative. So by way of explanation, maybe the image speaks for itself, but the pathological culture is a power-oriented culture, a culture that is preoccupied with personal power, needs, and glory, characterized by large amounts of fear. People hoard information or withhold it for political reasons or distort it to make themselves look better. Bureaucratic culture is rule-oriented. It is preoccupied with rules, positions, and departmental turf wars. So bureaucratic organisations protect departments, and departments want to maintain their turf and only do things by the book. So communication is often constrained by the rules. In Westrum's paper, it uses a very powerful example from 9/11, where the New York Police Department was aware that the North Tower was going to collapse, but the way that was communicated through the hierarchy meant that message did not get to the New York Fire Department, resulting in many firemen not being able to exit the towers before they collapsed. The third type of culture, generative culture, is a performance-oriented culture. This culture concentrates on the mission itself. It is less interested in people or position. They focus on how do they accomplish their goal. Everything is subordinate to getting the outcome. And Westrum uses the way that the Apollo 13 crisis was addressed as an example of a generative culture. Everyone does what they need to do to get those astronauts home. So it is this generative culture that we see as being the one that underpins organisations where there is high impact to software delivery, organisational performance, and of course this research came from looking at safety in organizations. So where there is better information flow, we have generative cultures, we have safer organizations, more responsible organizations, better performant organizations. So that's all great, but if you don't have that, how do you get it? John Shook, a thought leader in the lean space, spent quite a number of years involved in a joint venture between General Motors and Toyota called NUMMI. And in this particular joint venture, the General Motors car manufacturing plant that had been closed down because it was the worst performing plant in General Motors was was relaunched in partnership with Toyota under this brand NUMMI. And what this new plant uses the same workers that worked on the plant that failed, but puts them under that Toyota lean style of management. And John was part of that journey. John says, what my NUMMI experience taught me that was so powerful was the way to change culture is not to first change how people think, but instead to start by changing how people behave. That is what they do. So, first thing we're going to need to do is optimize teams for information flow, because we know that where there is free-flowing information, we get better cultures, we have safer cultures, more responsible cultures, better performing cultures. We want those teams to be mission focused so that they have, like the Apollo 13 example, they have a clear mission that everybody can align behind. We want those teams to be small, and small is important for information flow. This graphic illustrates how the number of people in a team impacts the number of lines of communication in a team. So here you get up to 14 people in a team, and we're talking about 91 different lines of communication. So the complexity gets harder, the ability to communicate gets harder, the ability to collaborate gets harder. So we like small teams. We recommend 7 ± 2, keeping it between that 10 and 36 lines of communication. It's an interesting study from Google in 2015, and they were looking at the basis of a high-performing team. And one of the things that they discovered is who is on a team matters less than how the team members interact, structure their work, and view their contributions. So how these small teams work is also important. So we suggest that teams start by visualizing their work. So again, our goal is free-flowing information. If we visualize what we are doing, whether that is physically on a wall or in our COVID environment using electronic tools, how can we see the work becomes important in terms of communication and transparency. Communicating daily. Some of you may be familiar with the idea of a daily stand-up. So we have that work, we're visualizing that work, we're now talking about what each of us as individuals are doing to help progress that work. Inspecting and adapting on cadence. So reflecting on how we work and making the time to change, adapt, improve how we work to do it better in the future. And demonstrating progress. So how do we provide transparency to our stakeholders around how we work? I like to call this minimal viable agility. And of course, many of you may recognize those practices as being common in the Agile community. Of course, working in the technology domain, it's more than just those how you work process pieces. We also need to look at the technical practices. So I think, you know, Agile often gets a rap as being fragile. It often gets a rap at being undisciplined. Agile should be, and was initially intended to be, a highly disciplined process. Software craftsmanship movement, also known as extreme programming, looks at how we can build quality into everything we do. When it comes to thinking about responsible tech, some of the practices that are really quite useful include pair programming. So getting more than one set of eyes looking at what is happening at any point in time. Extreme programming teams pair 80 to 100% of the time. So that is 2 people, 1 computer, 1 monitor, 1 mouse, and taking in turns for one to code and the other to navigate. There's a pattern called strong pairing from Llewellyn Thelko that says, for an idea to get from my head into the computer, it has to go through somebody else's hands. So we have 2 sets of eyes on everything. There's a really great example from Menlo Innovations, described in the book Joy Inc. by Richard Sheridan. And his company is an entire XP company, and they pair 100% of the time, and they swap pairs every week. So they have 100% redundancy across their entire ecosystem. Everything they do has been seen by at least 2 folks at any point in time. Test-driven development. What are our standards? How do we build them into what we're doing? Let's start with our expectations and then work to meet those. Test-driven development helps us ensure quality in what we do. And collective ownership is around how we treat our technology assets. We want our technology to be in a way, be left in a way that any member of our organization can pick it up and change it at any point in time. So everything is appropriately commented, stored, labeled, so that it is easily accessible. All of these practices, again, come back to that idea of information flow. If you wanted to get really wacky and wild, you could try something called mob programming. The idea is, as pointed out here, all the brilliant people working on the same problem at the same time on the same computer. So we've taken pair programming and stepped it up again. We have an entire team with 1 computer, 1 mouse, 1 keyboard, 1 screen, everybody working together to solve the problem. So we have all the best minds focused on the problem at all times. Sounds expensive? Maybe, maybe not. People who do this for a living consider it to be far more cost effective due to the quality of the outcome. Of course, if there's one thing we want to remember about how that team works, it is sustainable pace. The probably most forgotten principle from the Agile Manifesto. Agile processes promote sustainable development. So we want these teams working no more than a 40-hour week, because the more overtime those teams do, the more mistakes they're going to make. Now, that's all great for teams, but most organizations are bigger than a single team. So scale it up. Nothing beats an Agile team except a team of Agile teams. We know from the research of Harvard Professor J. Richard Hackman that 30% of team effectiveness depends on the quality of the team's launch for the life of the team. So this relates to both that individual team I've just talked about and the team of teams concept that I've just introduced. When we kick off teams and we want to build that underlying generative culture, we start by building the social fabric of the organization. You want to create connections between individuals. Really great tool from Jürgen Opello that has individuals create these little mind maps about their world and then share them with their colleagues as a way to get to know each other. We like to run that as a speed dating exercise when we're creating new teams and new teams of teams to create that social fabric of the organisation. We then want to scale that from person to person to team to team. So we'll ask that team of teams to pick a theme, pick a name, and then let's get every team on that team of teams with an identity, a shared identity and a unique identity. An example here of a team of teams with a dragon theme. With these team names decided and a little bit of initial introduction, we ask the teams to spend some time building what we call a product box. The idea of product boxes comes from Luke Homan's Innovation Games, where he has organizations think about what their product might look like on a supermarket shelf. What we do is ask teams to create the box they might come in if they were for sale on a supermarket shelf. And then we have them share with the other teams. And what we're starting to do is, again, continuing to build that social fabric, and we're starting to create vulnerability-based trust by having those people step outside their comfort zone and do something a little bit fun in front of their new team members, including the leadership. And you can see in the photos here, group of general managers with their Puff the Magic Dragon product box. If we want to change those behaviors, it starts with training. So we need to decide what the behaviors are that we want to change, and then we need to provide the training to reinforce that. And this is one of the things that creates the culture change. We see educating folks on how you want them to work as the moral obligation of the leadership. So if you want people to work differently, if you think that working in this manner would be a better choice for your organisation, then you need to provide the underlying education. From a point of view of, again, flow of information and alignment, it can be very valuable to take your team of teams through training all at once. So you can see there how we do large scale training to create that alignment. But it's more than just how we kick off. We need to keep reinforcing that social fabric over and over again. And we have to create the space for that. So if we want to create an environment in which people hold each other to account, we also need to create an environment where people have connections. So one of the practices we like is called Unity Hour. And we bring that team of teams together for 1 hour every 2 weeks, every month, depending on the organisation. And during that time, we have teams share information. We do learning activities. We'll do social networking. Our interest is in creating connections between people. How do we create connections that people will be able to use when they are struggling with the work that they do? And of course, just once isn't enough. Once every 2 weeks or once a month isn't enough. How about every day we create connections across those teams of teams? So we like a pattern we call daily cocktail hour, a cascading set of daily communications or stand-ups that start with the leadership team connecting, followed by the individual teams connecting, and then bringing together representation from all of the teams. So you can bring your challenges here and get support from the other individuals in the organisation. So it's not just the day-to-day challenges, but also how we deal with systemic issues that is important. So we have our teams practicing that minimum viable agility. We have them doing that inspect and adapt on cadence, maybe every 2 weeks. What we want is to understand where the teams are having struggles that are beyond the team. So we want to identify systemic challenges. So we ask teams to bubble up, bring to the leadership the challenges they are facing, so we can start to see the bigger problems across the ecosystem and we can start to address those. One mechanism for addressing those challenges and encouraging learning and, again, free-flowing information is communities of practice. We like the language that comes from the Spotify paper by Henrik Nieberg and Anders Ivarsson in 2012, where they talk about two different types of communities of practice. A chapter being a group of people who have the same function, and a guild, which is a more open community of practice. And you'll see the chapter is creating connections across teams, within one team of teams, as it's at Spotify they would call a tribe, and the guild is creating connections from one of those tribes to another. So we're creating environments in which we are fostering the free flow of information, trying to build that generative culture. It's important to remember to lead by example. One of the findings that has come out of this work is that lean styles of leadership are very conducive to generative cultures. Brené Brown is a researcher on vulnerability, shame, among other things, and a great quote from her here. The vulnerability paradox: the first thing I look for in you and the last thing I want you to see in me. So we've said we want folks on our teams to raise challenges. They see something that is not right, we want them to communicate that. That's going to require some vulnerability from those team members. So we've created an environment which we've created safety, hopefully among the teams and the team members, but we also need to create an environment that full stop is perceived as a safe place to fail. So how leaders deal with challenges is going to dictate how the organization deals with challenges. If the leaders admit mistakes, then teams and team members will admit mistakes. And of course, don't forget to communicate the mission. So we know at the heart of the generative culture is the focus on mission. And for the team to have focus on mission, it needs to know what the mission is. And again, it falls to leadership to be clear around what is that mission that we are asking that team and team of teams to focus in on. So you might want to measure this. One of the places that there is some writing around the idea of generative culture is the book Accelerate, from the folks at IT Revolution Press. It's based on a study over many years of high-performing teams and DevOps. And they created a survey that you can conduct with your organizations that focuses in on how organizations communicate and can start to identify different types of cultures. So, a couple of parting thoughts. The role of information in making systems safe is profound. So if we want responsible tech, we're going to need free-flowing information. And remember, if you have the discipline to make decisions with respect for people front of mind, you can't go wrong. Create an environment in which people feel safe, in which you do the right thing by the people, and the people will do the right thing by you. Thank you very much. If you enjoyed some of those concepts, you may enjoy my book, which is Tribal Unity. If you're interested in working with us around what we do, my contact details are there. And happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. As always, really engaging and lots of good stuff there, Em. We do have a question here about the bubble up system.
Yeah.
So how does that work and what are the tips on setting it up?
Sure. So in an agile environment, we would have the teams doing that inspect and adapt or retrospective at the end of their 2-week sprint or iteration, but whatever cadence you set. We ask the teams as part of their retrospective or inspect and adapt event to not just identify ways for themselves to improve as a team, but also to identify things that are hurting them, that would that require improvement, that they can't solve for themselves. So things outside the team's control. We hold a cadence-based session where every team sends that information to the leadership. So it can be brought by any member of the team. They say, here are the things that we're noticing. You know, we've found a security flaw in our infrastructure and we can't get it fixed. And then we hear that from multiple teams and we start to see systemic issues. So we're gathering that feedback. We're getting the teams to cross-pollinate. Sometimes the teams have already solved it. So one team says, you know, this is a challenge, and the other team goes, yep, but here's how you solve for that. Sometimes they're bigger things that the organisation needs to take ownership of. And you know, if there was a tip, it would be make sure you follow through. So there's nothing worse than asking a group of teams to give you a bunch of problems and then doing nothing with it. I can remember many years ago running a process like this, and people stopped bringing us problems, and I asked them why, and the answer I got was, you don't do anything with it, so we don't bring you problems anymore. So you know, action is a big part of that.
Yeah. You did talk a lot about communication, but just building on that, how would you suggest that tech teams can best communicate with the rest of the business and vice versa?
Yeah. So I quickly showed you our cocktail hour construct. And there was at the bottom of the page, there was a team of teams communication sync. So one of the things that works in a lot of environments is that, I mean, I would envisage that as a stand up. The way I would envisage, the way I say stand ups is anybody is welcome. So certainly if you have a business that is really interested, they may well turn up every day for that 15-minute sync. It's a really valuable way to know what's going on. We also talked about the teams demonstrating progress, and I talked about that as a team level, but that is actually also a pattern that is true at a team of teams level. So if you're trying to get more senior buy-in, you may not want it might be a little bit of information overload to go and see lots and lots of teams demonstrate progress. So we'll often hold what we would call an art show. We use the analogy of a train, an agile release train for a team of teams. So an art show is a agile release train show, but it's bringing together the team of teams to demonstrate the fully integrated solution. So all parts working together that makes sense as an executive level, and I would recommend doing that every 2 weeks at a minimum.
Right, thank you. Now we do have another one here from John Whittle, who just says, can you please comment on how these ideas can support putting ethics into tech? Are there new practices needed, or are these existing approaches enough?
I think, so do these approaches exist everywhere? Not in my experience. In fact, most organisations that we work with really struggle around communication flow and collaboration. So you know, the focus in here on communication and collaboration is based on the premise that of Westrom's work that says this improves safety within organisations, and extrapolating from that it will improve ethics within organisations. So you're talking about highly transparent organisations and highly collaborative organisations. It's harder to hide in an organisation that works like this, and there's a set of peer pressure that creates more ethical organisations. I don't think this is a panacea. I think it's a really big, complex area, but these are certainly ways in which we can encourage and foster more ethical environments.
Great, thank you, Em. Did you have any final comments on what you would like people to take away? So if we're thinking about what people are going to go back and do in their jobs tomorrow, is there one piece of advice that you'd have?
Um, Look at how freely information flows inside your organization. If you, that it really is, it is that simple. How does information flow? How freely does it flow? And then what can you do to improve that flow of information? That'd be my best advice.
Wonderful. Well, I'd like to thank you again for your time, and all of the insights that you had and all of the questions coming through. That does actually bring us to the end of the second day. So I'd like you to put your hands together and please thank Em Campbell Priddy. Thank you so much, Em.
Thanks, Adina.